Hello, I'm Dave Hill. I'm the founder, editor, and publisher of the website onlondon.co.uk, which writes about the capital city, its politics and policy, and attempts to be some sort of antidote to all the rampant anti-London propaganda there is out there in the world. And these podcasts are sort of to complement that. My guest today, if we can call him a guest, he's a friend really, and a frequent contributor to On London, is Lewis Baston. If you haven't been reading his stuff on London, you will have read him in lots of other places because he's one of the most respected elections analysts in the whole country. Lewis has written beautiful pieces recently about a couple of by-elections in very different parts of London. Each had a significant result, and I'm going to ask him to tell us a bit about those two contests and the outcomes and what they mean. So, Lewis, the first one, which was a couple of weeks ago, was in the borough of Hounslow in a ward called Cranford. Now, this is a very safe Labour seat historically. You described it in your piece for the website as a working class area with quite an even mix of housing tenure types. Quite a large percentage of the community identifies as Asian, you've got quite a lot of Muslim Londoners, Sikh Londoners and Hindu Londoners. About 57%, I think, would describe themselves as Asian in the census. Labour won the seat, and they won it on paper quite comfortably, but there was a bit more to it than that, wasn't there? So tell us a bit more about the result and what it means, please.
Right. Well, thank you, Dave. Thanks for having me on your podcast. It's great to sort of open another avenue of my connection with On London. Hounslow Cranford was a pretty interesting result. As you say, it's historically a very safe Labour seat, and its political history has been wrapped up in its sort of ethnic history, that it was the ward in 1982. It was one of the two wards in Hounslow that elected the first Asian councillors to Hounslow Council. It is in the orbit of Heathrow. There's this sort of shadow city that stretches kind of around Heathrow out to Slough and Windsor and into Ealing. And Cranford is very central in that. Sort of between Hounslow West and Hatton Cross. And the politics of it in the by-election were quite interesting because the Conservatives gained quite a bit. And this is unusual. The Conservatives have had a miserable time in London borough by-elections. Their vote's often been down. It's down on average. Cranford was an exception. The Conservative vote was up sort of more than 10%, which was, as I say, it's exceptional. And Labour was correspondingly down. One of the things that didn't kind of make an impact, and I thought before the election maybe it would, was the Green candidate, Gurpal Virdi, who's a very well-known figure sort of historically in the policing of London. He was unfairly dismissed and kind of persecuted by the Met, and there was an official report in this in the early 2000s. And he was a Labour councillor for a bit and joined the Greens, quite a famous guy, quite a well-known person in the area. But somehow Green campaign didn't catch fire, and it was the Conservatives who made the gains.
What about Reform? They got 17%.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Dave. Thanks. 17% really isn't bad for Reform for this kind of community. The more propitious areas for Reform in London have started to get kind of more than 20%. In the one they gained in Bromley a few weeks ago, over 30%. 17% for a multi-ethnic, working class area of London is pretty high.
Yeah.
And you can see the average performance of Reform quarter by quarter growing in these by-elections.
Yes. So on this particular one, I think you said this in your piece, we've seen, and it's perilous to overgeneralise, but I think you said in your piece that that this by-election, in terms of the Conservative pickups, relatively speaking, perhaps a bit more evidence that that some groups of Asian Londoners, perhaps Hindu and Sikh Londoners, are gravitating towards the Conservatives a bit more than they used to.
Yeah, I think there's something kind of long term going on with communities of Indian origin in their attitude to the Conservatives and Labour. You can trace it back a bit to 2022 when the Conservatives had an absolutely miserable set of borough elections, but they gained Harrow, and the swing to them was highest in the most Hindu areas of Harrow. And you can see it in the general election. Harrow East becoming the safest Conservative seat in the country, bizarrely.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the Conservatives picking up Leicester East. And I think you could see a few other hints of it in the London elections and by-elections as well. And I think there's a lot going on. I'm not an expert in sort of what drives voting in each community, but there have been, I think, the rise of Rishi Sunak, for instance, was part of it, although obviously these things started before Sunak. So it's not just a simple matter of identifying a community with party. But I think looking forward, as you say, it's dangerous to project.
Yeah.
That it's quite possible the Conservatives will do quite well in areas of London where Labour has been dependent on the votes of Hindu and Sikh Londoners for a while.
Okay, just speaking specifically for a moment more about the Cranford result in Hounslow, and I think you said that Labour have got a pretty hefty majority there, so they would have to lose an awful lot of ground to lose control of the borough overall next May. However, given the sort of mix of the demographic mix you've got in that ward. And I know it's difficult to. I know you can't be certain about these things, but it looks as though you might be tempted to think that Labour lost some supporters to the Conservatives and perhaps lost some to Reform as well. Is that a reasonable theory? Would you say?
It's a reasonable theory, yeah. I mean, the other thing with local by-elections is that the turnout's often a bit low, so it may be that Labour have failed to energise their own supporters. But that's another symptom of disaffection as well as voting for the Tories or Reform.
Great, thank you very much. Now let's move towards the centre, as it were, to West Hampstead, which was last Thursday's by-election. The West Hampstead ward of Camden. I'm tempted to be rather frivolous and say that the name West Hampstead kind of speaks for itself in terms of the sorts of Londoners we're talking about. Fair comment?
Yeah, pretty fair. It is a metropolitan Liberal ward. It's full of working age professionals who live in flats and generally have quite liberal values. And you can see for sort of the last 30 years it's been quite a contest between Labour and the Lib Dems. I mean, each have had their periods of being up and down, but basically it is a contest for this sort of heartland of the metropolitan Liberal Hampstead.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the result was a very striking gain for the Lib Dems.
Yeah, it was a landslide. The Lib Dems had done reasonably well in the 2022 election. I mean, actually, interestingly, their candidate in this by-election was the candidate who'd missed out only narrowly by 38 votes in 2022. But the Liberal Democrats really swept it.
What did they do right?
Well, it was probably always going to be a Lib Dem game because they were not far behind. They're good at campaigning. People sort of come from all over, particularly if it's... West Hampstead is plugged into the London Transport network as few other places are. It's got 3 stations all in a row on different lines. And so it's easy to get to. So lots of campaigning, lots of leaflets. They had a good candidate, Janet Grauberg, who'd been involved in food banks and educational sort of work in the ward. They had a Labour government that had rather annoyed a lot of the sort of people who live in Hampstead. And what they had working against them, though, was that Camden Council's a reasonably popular council, as councils go, and Labour tried hard. It was a proper knockdown kind of traditional kind of campaign.
Yes, you absolutely. Yes, you really did emphasise that they put in a lot of effort. So that must make it even more disappointing for them.
Yeah, it's a pretty stinging result for Labour. I mean, I think it was kind of, there are lots of reasons you could cite why the Lib Dems were going to win, but to win that big and for the Labour vote to just be down just over 20% is pretty abject.
Okay, so just sort of panning out to the sort of wider picture, and I'm not going to be so beastly as to ask you to make firm predictions for next May in terms of either of the boroughs we've been talking about, or anywhere else. But there has been a steady stream of London borough by-elections throughout this year, and indeed since the general election last year. So, if you can you put these two results in the wider context of what has happened across the capital since in the last 7 or 8 months, or indeed the year or so since the general election, and what it means for the various parties?
Yeah, I mean, they're part of a consistent story of pretty rough results for London Labour Party. The Hounslow Cranford one is possibly sort of revealing of what may happen across a swathe of West London in particular. I mean, you've got sort of similar demographics in wards in Ealing and Brent as well as in Hounslow. So you can see, even if the Conservatives aren't doing very well generally, you can see a possibility of the Conservatives picking up quite a bit in these boroughs. Hard to see them winning control, though. Labour's defending huge majorities on most London boroughs. They did very well indeed in 2022, and a lot would have to go wrong for them to lose control of boroughs such as Hounslow or Camden. And another factor in this is that, as the two by-elections show, the threat to Labour comes from all different directions. Now, in a sense, that is good for Labour up to a point, as long as they don't get too unpopular. If the opposition is splintered between all different sorts of parties, that may mean that Labour can survive on a low share of the vote. On the other hand, if Labour's popularity dips too far, they end up losing to everyone on all fronts, rather as the Conservatives did in the 2024 general election. So, looking at it, I mean, as an election analyst, you sort of tend to look at things incrementally. What changes? You look at the baseline from last time and what the swings might be and what might change. That's usually a good way of looking at things. But it doesn't always work, particularly if there's a big tidal wave. I mean, for instance, I thought Conservatives would do badly and Reform would do well in the 2025 local elections outside London. I was very taken by surprise by the fact that Reform did quite as well as they did and swept aside apparently solid-looking Tory councils. You've got a sort of... West Hampstead in particular makes me feel perhaps Labour are at risk of that kind of thing happening in London in 26.
So I could probably answer this question myself. I was going to say, what does Labour have to do to sort of recover its popularity? And I suppose that really does depend overwhelmingly on what the national government does.
It is very much about the national government. I don't think voters are particularly annoyed with their borough councils any more than they always are. It's quite interesting doing these by-elections. You detect and writing them up. You detect common threads, and one of them I noticed is fly tipping. That really annoys people and is often the fuel for local by-election campaigns. So there are some local issues that councils can do to make it better, but it's not. The councils aren't the main problem. Sadiq Khan is not the main problem. It is the central government that needs to do something that Londoners like.
Okay. Coming on to the Conservatives, and I'm sort of fascinated and also, full disclosure, a bit horrified by the Conservatives in London, Conservatives in general, but the Conservatives in London, and this whole question of what the Conservatives need to do to recover in the capital is one that's been around for several years. And I've seen you being very interesting and eloquent, speaking to with some of the more, shall we say, progressive Tories across the capital in the past, going back 3 or 4 years. Um, Nothing really seems to change. Now, if you imagine yourself, Lewis, that you were in charge of the Conservative Party in London and you weren't going to get too much interference from upstairs at the National Party, let's say, if you don't mind answering this question, what would you be trying to do? How would you be trying to remodel the Conservatives for the capital city to try and help them to recover from their long-term declining position?
Goodness, they would need, the first thing they need to do is actually to give the impression of liking London. That would be a start. Because it seems to me that the sort of the party nationally has a problem. I mean, the London Conservatives clearly have deep problems. The party nationally seems to regard London as a punch bag, and the party's national strategy kind of overrides anything that they're doing in London, other than sort of a certain amount of kind of outer London feeling against London and feeling fears of social change and so on. They can win a bit of support like that, but it's not really a strategy for London. I think surely I'm just tempted to say something rude about Susan Hall here, but I shouldn't. But yeah, I mean, their leadership in London needs refreshing. I mean, there is stuff they can do at borough level that they're sort of, although Labour won Wandsworth and Westminster in 2022, I mean, these are the sort of places that kind of could theoretically respond to the kind of Tory message that they'd been running locally with some success for some time, that were sort of sound managers, we keep the taxes down, we provide efficient services. We are a sort of young, professional, multi-ethnic crew of people who have kind of conservative values. There is future in that, and I imagine that's probably the sort of approach they'll actually use in some of these areas in the next borough elections, to try and sort of cordon off the Wandsworth Tories from the National Party's kind of decay.
Sure. Okay, that's great. Thank you. And what about briefly the other parties? There's quite a lot of chat amongst the sort of circles that we move in about how well reform might do in some parts of London next May, and then the Greens have long been a place where disaffected Labour voters turn to. They didn't in that Hounslow by-election, as you noted, but that was sort of a bit different. In other kinds of boroughs, that might happen. And then there's the interesting position of the Lib Dems, who are kind of absolutely bedded in some boroughs. So can you just briefly take us through the prospects for those other three, insofar as you can look that far ahead? What do you think might happen?
Sure. I think reform, certainly there are areas of outer London where you can see them winning quite well. Places that are similar to the kind of areas where they swept the board in the county elections in 2025. Bexley, for instance, seems to me kind of, they might get an overall majority there. Bromley, they can make inroads, etc. So I can see them sort of nibbling around the edges of London. I hesitate before saying anything about Havering politics, because it is its own world, yeah. But I mean, it's possible they might do well there.
Okay, so the Greens.
But Greens, the Greens' problem has always been organisation and targeting. They are they sort of won a significant group in Lambeth in 2018, and a lot of them lost in 22. So they have that sort of problem. I think there's a great opportunity for the Greens in a lot of inner London, lots of disillusioned Labour voters, lots of people who are receptive to the Green message. But they need to get plausible candidates in place, deliver the leaflets, and so on. And that's where they've often fallen down in the past.
Okay, and what about the Lib Dems?
Yeah, the Lib Dems, as you said, have these fortresses in Kingston, Sutton, Richmond, and you can only see them being consolidated, I think. I mean, their target, I guess, is to break back onto some of these inner London boroughs where they were wiped out in the coalition years. And for Lib Dem interest, be watching Merton, really, to see
right.
if they could. Because they won the Wimbledon parliamentary seat and they've been advancing in Merton, so that Merton might be the next. Although Labour are very well dug in at the Mitcham end of the borough, but you can see the Lib Dems. They're good at targeting. Lib Dems are targeting masters. So if they could chip off one or two of the Labour block of wards and eat the remaining Conservative presence in Merton. Could be interesting.
Okay, it's a shifting landscape.
Very much so.
Lewis, thank you so much. That's been so interesting. I think we'll wrap it up there. And don't forget, audience, that you could see not only Lewis's excellent write-ups of not two by-elections we've been discussing, the two very recent ones, but also a whole string of them going back into last year. If you just go to the On London website and find a piece by Lewis and click on his byline, they're all there archived for your pleasure and delight. Lewis, I hope you'll join me for future podcasts to talk about what else is happening in the near future. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. This is me saying goodbye.